Chapter 2. Westward Ho to Missouri. Garden Spot of the Earth. On Saturday, June 10, 1843, surveyor Alfred W. Morrison was shooting a line east between sections 4 and 9, Township 58, Range 33, about a mile west of the original border of the United States, in the southeastern corner of Andrew County. Missouri became a state in 1821. According to the first census taken, the population was 70,647, of whom 11,251 were slaves. At that time, the western border of the state ran north from the Arkansas Territory to the Iowa Territory. In 1837, President Martin Van Buren issued a proclamation that the Indian Territory that extends west of the old borderline to the Missouri River would become part of Missouri. The new territory would add 6 new counties: Atchison, Nottoway, Holt, Andrew, Buchanan, and Platte. Before the new land could be settled, it had to be surveyed. That was what Alfred Morrison was doing on that day in June. Back in Indiana, Greenberg and Rhoda Mullenix had heard about the new land being opened up for settlement in northwestern Missouri, and they were getting the itch to move further west. The following year, they loaded up their belongings and headed out, arriving in Andrew County in 1844. In May of 1846, Abram and Millie sold their farm, and in August they requested a letter of dismission from the Deer Creek Primitive Baptist Church, and it was granted. They bid all their friends a final farewell and set out for what was known as the Garden Spot of the Earth. Between 1844 and 1846, the entire Hearst family made the long trip from Indiana to Missouri to settle in Andrew County. If they traveled overland and not by riverboat, this could have been, and probably was, the route they took. They would have crossed the Wabash River into Illinois, and journeyed across that state to the Mississippi River. Here they would have boarded a ferry boat and crossed into Missouri. After traveling about 30 miles, they crossed the Fabius River, and passed through the town of Bethel. Here wagon trains were being outfitted for the 2,000-mile trip over the Oregon-California Trail. Shortly after leaving Bethel, they crossed the North River. It was a hot time for traveling during August and September, but they didn't have to contend with flood-swollen rivers and muddy creeks like they would have in the spring. That time of year it was usually rainy, cold and disagreeable, and the crossings could become very difficult and dangerous. Cold weather and snow could also be encountered during the month of March in this part of the country, so consequently, travel in a Conestoga at this time of year was probably as good as it could get. On the 38th day of their journey, they would have entered the eastern part of DeKalb County after crossing the Grindstone Creek, and camped for the night. The next day they set out on the final day of their 500-mile trip, passing through what are now the towns of Weatherby, Mayville, and the northern edge of Amity. A few miles further on, they came to the third fork of the Platte River, located near the former West Missouri boundary line that separates Andrew and DeKalb counties. William Bays and family had arrived at this location the previous year. The town of Boxford was located here several years later, but today no trace of Boxford can be found. A half-mile north, the Bays had found an excellent spring, and an abandoned cabin. This is where they made their home. The Hearst very likely stopped and drank from the spring and visited with the Bays. They crossed the creek, and a half-mile further, arrived in Andrew County. After going another mile in a northwesterly direction, on the trail known as the Plattsburgh to Savannah Road, they passed within a half-mile of the farm, where Abram's great-great-grandson, this writer, would spend most of his adult life, beginning in 1952, 106 years later. They continued in that direction for another 6 miles, where they arrived at Rochester, a busy little community on the banks of the Platte River. They had reached their destination. When the family arrived in Missouri in 1846, Abram was 59 years of age, and Millie 43. Gilbert was 21 and his wife Adeline, about 19, and their son Alfred 6 months. Morgan was 17, Elijah 15, Stephen 13, Rebecca 11, my great-grandpa Abram Jr. was 8, and the baby Eliza was 2. Prior to the organization of the county, quite a number of pioneer families settled near the most likely proposed site of the town. This they did early for the purpose of locating available claims on the Platte River. Home seekers followed soon after, and by 1842-43, most of what became Rochester Township was occupied, including the site of the town that would be called Rochester. It was owned by Levi Thatcher, and later sold to a Mrs. Kibbe, whose sons erected a saw and grist mill on the Platte River, in about 1842-43. The thing that drew them to this location was the natural rock bottom in the river. It made an excellent crossing for the Plattsburgh-Savannah Road. There was also a natural waterfall, just below the crossing. This is where they established the water-powered mill. It soon became a flourishing settlement. The mill supplied lumber and bread to a large part of the territory. The community grew so fast that in June 1848, a town plat was laid out, containing 10 blocks and 60 lots. In 1853, an additional 45 lots were added, and in May 1855, another 13 lots were added. Many business houses were erected, and residences sprung up, and it became a thriving town, and was the main source of supplies for a large portion of Andrew and DeKalb counties. As I write this story, no business establishments remain in present-day Rochester, and only 60 people inhabit the once bustling town. The last business closed in the early 1980s. Abram's older married children, by his first wife, settled northeast of Savannah, along the 102 River near the Kaufman Cemetery and Kaufman School. This was in the area south of the little town of Wyeth, formerly called Rush. Russell and Cynthia Hurst Dobbs had at one time lived in the area where the town of Rhea is now located. It's about c north of the Kaufman community, and was known as the town off Russell. It was named after Russell Dobbs, and carried the name up into the 1880s, when it was changed to Roa, because there was another town in Missouri, called Russell. They later moved into the Kaufman neighborhood, near the Kaufman Cemetery. They lived there the remainder of their lives, and are buried in that cemetery. It is not known how long Abram and Millie lived in the Rochester area, but it is thought to have been a short time. In about 1847-52, they acquired an 80-acre farm, about a mile west, and 3 miles, north of Savannah, in the east half of the SW1 quarter, of Section 23, T60N, R36W, where they would make their home for the remainder of their lives. It seems like tragedy struck this family periodically, however back in those days, when medicine was in its infancy, death was a familiar visitor to most families. In 1851 or 52, their oldest son of their second family, Gilbert, and his wife Adeline, and their 3 small sons, Alfred, Richard, and John, accompanied by Gilbert's brother Elijah, set out on a trip back to Indiana for a visit. Adeline had not seen her family for about 5 years, and the boys had never seen their grandparents. They were looking forward to the steamboat trip down the Missouri, to the Mississippi, on down to the Ohio, up the Wabash, and overland 30 miles to Putnam County, where their loved ones and old friends awaited them. The joyous reunion turned to tragedy, and changed this family forever. Gilbert came down with typhoid fever, and what had been a happy reunion, turned into his final trip home. He was buried at his boyhood home, in Putnam County, Indiana. It was a tearful farewell, as Adeline, and her 3 sons, and brother-in-law, Elijah, boarded the steamboat, for the long journey home. They would bear the tragic news to the rest of the family. After the death of her husband, one would think that the family's disasters had ended, but they were far from being over. The terrible climax came, when Adeline also came down with typhoid fever, aboard the riverboat, and passed away, leaving the 3 little boys, ages 6, 4, and 2, to face the world alone. This ill-fated journey came to an end, when the riverboat docked at St. Joseph, Missouri, and Adeline was buried there. However, the heartbreak had not ended. On Wednesday, June 30, 1852, tragedy struck once again in the Abram Hurst family, when little 8-year-old Eliza, their youngest, passed away at the tender age of 8. The family was devastated. She was the apple of their eye. The cause of her death is not known, but it could have been and probably was typhoid fever. During this period, this dread disease took many lives. Sunday, May 16, 1858, my great-grandfather Abram Hurst Jr., 19 years of age, married Margaret Cole, age 16, daughter of Jeremiah Cole, and Rebecca Young Cole, of Jeremiah Cole.